Welcome back to the Group Practice Accelerator podcast, brought to you by Polaris Healthcare Partners, where we leverage decades of healthcare and business experience to drive growth in successful group practices just like yours. If you're a healthcare entrepreneur and you're interested in building, scaling, or exiting your group practice, you've found not only the industry's leading resource for business education, but a team of trusted advisors dedicated to helping you achieve and exceed your goals. In short, the team at Polaris creates clarity, confidence, and results. I'm your host, Jamie Falasz, and the Group Practice Accelerator podcast is on the air. Well, hey everyone, thanks for joining me for this first episode of the new year. And today we're going to be talking about your money and what better way to kick off the new year, right? I don't even need to ask for a show of hands as to who would like to see continued positive turns when it comes to the economy. So today we're going to talk about what 2026 is going to look like, as much as anyone can predict the future, of course. And I say that a little bit tongue in cheek because we do have tools and information at our disposal. And if you know where to find it, you know how to use it, and more importantly, interpret it, it can certainly give you a likely picture of what to expect from our economy, the markets, and closer to home, your money. And that matters to you as our listeners because the cost of capital will directly impact how you buy everything from equipment, meaning same store growth improvements, to an acquisition or de novo build, to how your providers borrow money for a buy in, to how your own deal is structured when you exit. So, for today's episode, for these purposes, we're going to focus on what impacts the capital you'd borrow to finance an acquisition, for example. And we know that things are very different during the pandemic, meaning money was really, really cheap and deals were flowing freely because buyers had just a lot more dry powder to work with. And a lot of docs sold or partnered with DSOs and did really well financially. But now we're 5 years out from that. And these same docs have questions around recapitalization and how that's going to play out for them, which is a fair question. So we're also going to talk about what M&A is going to look like for this year and how we're validating that, because we always want to use evidence-based decision making, especially when it comes to your life's work and your financial security. And who better to walk us through financial intricacies than our founder and CEO, Diwakar Sinha. Diwakar, welcome back to the show.
Jamie, thanks for having us and happy new year to everyone.
Yeah, I can't believe we're already in 2026.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
so I want to kick off by referencing an article that you wrote. I believe it came out December 17th. And, it's talking about the state of the economy, what that's going to look like for 2026, and a couple of other elements in there that I want to get to. And we had a lot of feedback and great response to this article. So I want to break a few things down in there that you talked about. First, recapitalization. I want to rewind for our listeners on that because we did have some docs that sold, in that 5 year window during the pandemic, and things are starting to happen for them now. And we want to talk about what recapitalization means. So maybe first, let's start here. If I partnered or sold to a DSO that's private equity backed, as many are, just to kind of use a generic scenario. And I've stayed on like 3 to 5 years chairside for X number of days a week. And I know every structure is different. But now that I'm 5 years out from that initial transaction, what does it mean to recapitalize? And maybe just walk listeners through not only the definition, but the reason in that whole scenario.
Yeah, so I want to put some qualifiers there, right? So because we get
Yeah.
calls on this a lot, how your deal is structured matters a lot. And we've in our previous podcasts have talked about structure matters over valuation. So I think we're getting calls a lot where people have potentially transacted and there's a transaction happening. And, if the holding company's transacting, are they getting any impact at the sub DSO JV level? Kind of economic waterfalls happening, right? So structure matters a lot and how your deal is negotiated into the drag along provisions at the JV level matter, right? So that's one. Beyond that, I want to kind of really go back to 2000 pre-COVID and kind of talk about the journey there. And then I think that can kind of relate to probably people that transacted in the COVID level.
Yeah.
So I talked earlier in the year about some level of concerns around when people transact and, go into a partnership with a strategic, what does that equity mean? Right? Because obviously they're looking for a good partner. They've had a 5, 10, 15, 25-year journey and running their practice. They're looking to bring on a bigger platform and they want that journey moving forward, right? So there are a lot of great platforms out there doing a really good job. So if you would have, let's say hypothetically, transacted around 2017 to 2019, you've entered a 3 to 5 year agreement and there's a potential thought process, hey, in 3 to 5 years, the platform I'm entering is going to have an exit. You know, well,
Yeah.
uh, well, they entered into, the transaction and then COVID happened. And this platform, started to go in and acquire during the COVID era between 2020 and 2022. And then, as I demonstrated in my article in 2022, one of the indexes started to climb up at a fairly rapid rate. And so, as these platforms acquired at a very rapid rate in that 2 year, 2.5 year period, and then they started to kind of digest their acquisitions, de novos, depending on the platform model, and kind of work on efficiencies that they need to normalize, and then look at, okay, what does 23 and 24 look like? Well, cost of capital was exponentially increasing.
Yeah.
And when they started to evaluate going to market, just look at one component of it, well, the market had softened because in the index I focus on, and a lot of these capital markets lenders are looking at is called SOFR. SOFR stands for Secured Overnight Financing, and that's where strategics and private equity are borrowing off of. And there's different indexes I've talked about on different podcasts. I think a lot of the consumers may focus on prime, and we tend to hear a lot about the Fed's funds rates and things like that. That tend to have indicative direct or indirect correlation to different indexes that are out there. But SOFR is what I focus on this article. So SOFR climbed approximately 500 basis points over that 2 year period. And that had a lot of impacts that I talk about in that article that caused a lot of challenges for a lot of strategics out there. So these people might have, transacted 2017 to 2019. Now that there's this hope of transacting in 23 to 24, valuations have softened and people aren't transacting. Or if
Right.
people would have gone to market, valuations are not there, you have a failed process. And
Mhm.
and I generally don't think that's okay. I think people just need to have patience because as you start to look around and you start to go into 25 and not 26, and that's we can talk more about that. We've been talking about this since early 2025 that the market is improving. The market's headed in the right direction. All the indications early 2025 demonstrated to us in all the indexes we looked at, hey, we're headed in the right direction. I think 2026 is going to be a really robust year for M&A.
Yeah, and I wanna go back to that article because we were talking about SOFR there, and I would love it if you could break that down a little bit for those who haven't read your article. Exactly what does that mean? What does that stand for? And I know you have a great graph to show us at some point, and I'll link to the article so people can see that graph. But I really wanted them to get a good picture of how that impacts us. And then I want you to kind of roll into, if you wouldn't mind, like explain how SOFR pre-pandemic, how that impacted deals and how it rolled into the impact on consolidation up until today.
Yeah, so in the article I talk about where SOFR was going into 2018
Mhm.
and 2019. SOFR against secured overnight finance rate, was about 200 basis points, just above 235 basis points in 2018 to 250 basis points, depending on where you track it in the year, and was slowly declining. So it was in a positive trend rate. And then if you start looking at different indexes, like the 5 year treasuries, the 7 year treasuries, the 10 year treasuries, and those are the indexes that people think about when they think about mortgages, those are starting to slowly have fluctuations on a downward trend. And if you got a mortgage during that time, you probably say, hey, I had pretty decent rates back then. Not to discount if you got a mortgage during COVID, right? I mean, that's probably the best time to get a mortgage.
Right. That's we're not going to see that.
Yeah, yeah. So, but pre-COVID, you did get reasonable rates, in 2019, and so these SOFR indexes were on a downward trend even pre-COVID. So the market was primed in M&A deployment pre-COVID. There's a lot of interest in consolidation, and if we go back towards the capital markets in all the healthcare segments pre-COVID, we saw really good valuations and a fairly good clip of consolidation already happening pre-COVID. And we saw this like 3-month window where consolidation stopped, M&A activity stopped with COVID. I think there's a freeze moment. People are just trying to understand what's going to happen with the pandemic and all these things. And then the moment we start to kind of get our hands around it, the market started to open up and the floodgates opened up. So, pre-COVID, the market was already there. The M&A activity was already happening. I just want to restate that the market
Yeah.
was primed for it, independent of COVID. Not that we have all the deal volume. The market conditions were really positive there, and I think people will go back to valuations in 2017, 18, 19. They will see some really good valuations happening up and downstream in the market of what was going on there. So all the data points are already there.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you brought that up because I think that there is a misconception among some that, the pandemic hit and things changed like that. Well, that's not true. We know that things were changing in the few years leading up to that. So, thank you for reiterating that. That's important. So then if we look at post-pandemic, like through 2024, let's go up to that point. What was the impact there on, deal volume and structure?
Yeah. So, and I think in the article I outlined specific milestones of where SOFR changes. But around the end of 2022, SOFR starts to climb, you know, at a fairly rapid clip. And I think the graph shows that, or the 2 year time frame and how it climbs. But the peak is around 530 basis points approximately on where the SOFR ends up. And the reason that's important is depending on the institutions that the strategics borrow from, they could have a cost of capital between, 250, 300 basis points to 600 basis points, depending on the cost structure that you are borrowing, if it's mezz financing, unitranche financing, or just typical senior debt that you might have in a middle market product. So if you are borrowing, let's say during COVID era or just right after COVID era, where cost of capital is 0.01 and your cost of capital is 0.01 plus 300 basis points or 400 basis points. Let's kind of just to keep math simple. So your rate was 4.01%. And let's say you deployed on a strategic acquisition for $20 million. That's your capital into it. Plus you might have put in some equity into it. On that $20 million, your interest rate is what it is. But then 2 years down the road, if that cost of capital goes from, 4.01% and now jumps up to 5.3% plus the 4%, now you're at 9.3% on that
Mhm.
same $20 million in capital deployed. But that's one strategic
Yikes.
acquisition you would have done. And that goes down even downstream to if you've done like a 2 location acquisition, 3 locations acquisition. So you have to look at that 2 year window and say, okay, what is a capital deployment per strategic, per geography, per market, and then kind of look at it on a bigger picture. And I think that's really where the issues came up. And, you saw some strategics start to, unwind their M&A team. You saw some strategics start to really focus on same store improvement. And so, I think the interest rate rise really put a lot of downward pressure on the strategics to really say, hey, how do we improve operations within our business because the interest is climbing. And if you have $100 million in capital deployed that you're borrowing and cost of capital improved by 5%, well, that's, $5 million in annual debt service and just interest alone that you're paying out there, right?
Yeah.
So that's a lot, right? So, and if you let's say your EBITDA on that $100 million in debt deployed is let's say $25 million, where 5 million is just going into the increased interest expense, not even the baseline interest expense you might have on top of that.
Wow.
So I just think those are important things to consider. That those are some of the things that these strategics had to focus on. And as they started to kind of work through those challenges coming out of it, and kind of smooth out their operations, and kudos to everyone that did. And I think they started to, they worked through those issues. They went through their operational efficiencies, and coming out in 24, 25, as SOFR started to improve up, said, hey, we're doing really well. We're understanding what methodical acquisition needs to look like or de novos needs to look like. Pricing conditions are improving. Now we're starting to see some breathing room, a lot of cash on balance sheet. We are going to, move forward. We have all this dry powder that in 23, 24 we did not deploy because we're focused on existing operational improvement. So you have all this pent up demand that is available going into 25, 26 that just because softening conditions are there, I think 26 is just right, for deployment of capital.
Yeah, and what better time, when money just was astronomically expensive than to keep things in-house and really, like you said, reflect and what can we do within our four walls or within your platform. Of course, we're referencing larger groups or even emerging groups there, but to really streamline operations and get things in just the right shape for when the economy does turn around and money doesn't cost quite so much. So, and with that, let's talk about the shifts in 2025. What we saw, you and I talked about this on several podcasts actually. So I'd like to kind of go back and review what we saw in terms of those shifts in 2025, and then let's start taking a look at 2026.
Yeah, so I mean, in 2025, we saw the M&A markets really start to open up a little bit, right? We saw buyers starting to, add M&A team. We saw significant additions in the M&A team from a lot of strategics. We saw that from a sponsor's lens, which is, when I say sponsors, in my article, I mean private equity groups. We saw a lot of it, kind of rehiring of the M&A team. Number one, that kind of showed the people are starting to look and say, "Hey, we need to start deploying capital." And that's typically like a leading indicator to say, "Okay, people are starting to get back on track, and we want to start deploying capital."
Yeah.
Now, in addition to that, we started to see people say, "Okay, hey, we're not going back to the 2020 deployment of capital of structure and there's not going to be a buying frenzy in a lack of a better word because I don't think people want to be loose in their structure. I think candidly from a and we are a sell side firm, not to discount. I think there's some structures done in 20 to 2022 that may not have been responsible. So I think going into 2025, 2026, people are responsible and how they structure these deals. And I think we do need to be prudent for how we think about the market going into the next 5 or 7 years and making sure as we structure these deals that they're responsible to make sure that the platform is successful and even the clients are successful, long term. So I think, the market is shifting. People are attracted to good operators. So businesses that are performing really well, valuations are improving. We saw that at the end of 2024, a single digit EBITDA business got almost double digits in valuation. So I think even end of 2024, we saw the market tick upward. And even in 2025, we've seen really good valuations in some of the deals we've taken to market that have been, really, inspiring that we to see that people have the desire that if you have a good business, you have a good operator, you have a good leadership team that can demonstrate that they can take ownership of a market and continue to grow that platform, that you have a bigger operator that's willing to work with that, structure the deal correctly, and pay the right valuation for that platform.
All right, so we're talking about a lot of changes and positive changes, of course, which we're all excited about. But let's talk about the evidence that we're looking at that supports that optimism. You had a graph that you showed me when we were
Mhm.
talking about this episode and talking about your article, because it's in the article as well. And I want to add that to our show notes. But let's talk about how that looks with our listeners. I know you can watch this on YouTube as well, but you'll have a copy of this graph. But let's talk about that evidence a little bit first.
Yeah, so I think in 2024, it was approximately 5.3%, uh, plus or minus a few basis points on the higher SOFR index. And right now it's approximately 150 basis points lower, and it's slowly been going down. And I believe it's about 75 or 80 basis points higher early in 2025. When we started to say market is declining slowly here. Like when I say declining, the SOFR is declining, which means it's actually a positive indicator we're headed in the right direction. So this 150 basis points reduction since the peak of the market in 2024 is really attractive. And even in the last few days since we released the article, SOFR has been declining.
Good
So,
news.
so it's a positive trend that, when I say declining point oh 0.01, it's about point oh 0.01 when you start tracking that over, a 30-day period, a week over a week, that's a positive trend. So,
Sure.
the small changes here and there do become over a course of a year a positive trend. So I think that 150 basis point reduction over the last year and a half is a good change. And I think going into 2026, if you see additional 25 to 50 basis points reduction, by the end of 2026, just those changes alone will have meaningful changes in the M&A market. I generally think the SOFR might have a more of a change, but even a 25 to 50 basis points change over the next year is going to have a meaningful change in the M&A market.
Yeah, certainly. Well, let's talk about what listeners can do to prepare their businesses now. Let's say I want to go to market in 2026. I'm thinking, end of Q2. I know that's quick, but if I'm thinking about it, what do I need to do today to prepare?
Well, yeah, I think that first of all, make sure you're ready for a partner. We always say that, like look at your business and say, am I ready for a partner? That's been our motto. I think probably going to early 2025 and 2024 in all our podcasts, because I think partnership's a very exciting thing when you're ready for one, and especially going to roll over some equity, and you might have a 3-year process, a 5-year process after that, and that. So I think that's one. Give us a call to understand and say, okay, where's my business today? Here's where I was headed, you know, and what does my journey look like in this process? Depending on the size of business, right? You're going to have a 4 to 6 month process, a 6 to 9 month process, or a 9 to 12 month process. And when I say those three qualifiers, that could be a 500,000, a million five EBITDA, a million five to $3 million EBITDA, or $3 million to $15 million EBITDA, right? So depending on the size of the business, those are going to be the qualifiers. The larger the EBITDA platform, the longer the process, because that's could be a strategic, could be a sponsor deal directly, and also in the early in the process, we need to start thinking about what is the cultural philosophy you're looking for, what is the clinical philosophy you're looking for. I think everyone focuses on EBITDA, and I think that's great to understand where EBITDA stands. But I think, one of the things that hopefully people take away from this process, when we think about when people did not have a capital event, in this process of what COVID caused and SOFR indexes climbed, is that, you want to make sure that when you have this transaction, if you are stuck longer for more than 5 years, that you actually like the partner you're with, and so
Yeah, critical piece.
so I generally want to make sure that, we align those interests, for our clients to make sure that those philosophies match up for both sides, and also
Yes.
for the buyer side, the client that we're bringing to them is philosophically the right client, clinically the right client. And I think if you can make that, I call it a marriage, a win-win, then I think those two businesses perform really well together, and can have an exponential outcome for both parties.
Yeah, and that's one thing I really love that you do that for our clients and really make sure that the philosophies, the vision, the mission, all that lines up because that is a long time to spend with a partner and you've got to have the same goals in mind or you're not going to get what you want at the end of the day. So, thank you for this great discussion. Again, Diwakar's article came out December 17th. I'm going to link it in the show notes along with some information about SOFR and the graph that we were talking about because I think taking a look at that visually can be really impactful. I know for me, we were having this discussion, but when I saw it kind of laid out over time and how things were changing even pre-pandemic, it kind of made a difference in my mind in how I comprehended that. And it sort of put the whole picture together for me. So, Diwakar, thank you so much. We appreciate your time as always.
Jamie, thanks for having me, and to all the audience members, I hope you guys have a great new year. 2026 is looking really positive, and I wish everyone a great 2026, personally and professionally.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you for another year of listening. We appreciate that you support us by subscribing to the podcast. And we love the questions that you send us. So keep them coming and we'll keep delivering the content that you all ask for. So if you want to learn about any of our Polaris expert advisory services, or maybe there's a topic that we haven't covered that you want to hear about, you can send us an email to info@polarishealthcarepartners.com, or you can reach us by visiting the website at polarishealthcarepartners.com. And you can hit the Contact Us button. Don't forget to check out our new events page. We have several events that we're going to be speaking at just in the first quarter of this year. So take a look at those as well. Thanks so much for being a loyal listener and subscriber. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a colleague and be sure to leave us a rating on any of your favorite podcast platforms. We'll see you on the next episode of the Group Practice Accelerator Podcast.